So this is the famous palace?
This is it, David's palace.
Here's the big question. Is the time of David historical or mythological?
He unites all the 12 tribes, builds the foundation of the house of God, what will be the temple. This influential character, the king, the poet, the leader, the warrior.
For over a century, historians and archaeologists insisted King David was a legend, a story invented long after the events it describes. They claimed there was no palace, no centralized authority, and no evidence a ruler matching his description ever sat on a throne in ancient Israel.
So we've entered into the palace.
Jim, I spent much of my career dealing with people called minimalists who said that David didn't exist. He was a mythological person.
But two archaeologists refused to accept that narrative. They dug where no one else would, ignored warnings from colleagues, and pressed on even as skepticism grew deafening. What they uncovered didn't just challenge the accepted timeline, it shattered it. Massive walls, city planning indicating centralized power, storage systems proving taxation and administration, all pointing to a civilization capable of supporting a king decades earlier than experts claimed.
Trying to prove the story of King David through the archaeological findings is an incredibly complex and hard endeavor because archaeology is dealing with small puzzle pieces being pulled out of the ground.
And at the summit of the site, a structure so vast that the moment its outline became clear, the room fell silent. Could this really be the palace of the man who shaped biblical history? And if so, why has the establishment fought so hard to keep it out of textbooks? Today, we step inside that discovery, exploring the evidence that rewrites history and revealing why the story of King David may finally be more than myth. It may be fact. The king who vanished from history. King David occupies one of the most contested spaces in ancient history. According to biblical texts, he was a towering figure who united 12 tribes under a single crown, established Jerusalem as the political and spiritual center of his kingdom, and laid the foundation for what would become the Temple of God. His authority supposedly stretched across the central highlands from the southern regions of Judah to the northern tribal lands. He commanded armies, collected tribute from surrounding peoples, appointed officials throughout his territory, and governed through a system of centralized control. The texts describe a ruler who transformed scattered tribes into a functioning state, a king whose decisions echoed through centuries of subsequent history. But when archaeologists went looking for physical evidence of this kingdom, they found almost nothing. No palaces emerged from the soil. No royal complexes revealed themselves beneath the layers of later construction. No administrative centers appeared with inscriptions naming David or confirming his rule. Excavation after excavation in Jerusalem and surrounding regions produced modest remains and limited construction. According to the material record, Jerusalem during the 10th century BCE looked more like a small hill settlement than the seat of power described in ancient accounts. The ground remained silent, and that silence grew louder with each passing decade. As findings accumulated, scholarly confidence shifted dramatically. Researchers who once assumed David's historicity began questioning whether the biblical description had been exaggerated over time. Some proposed that David existed, but not as a powerful monarch. Perhaps he was a local leader, a tribal chieftain influential in his immediate region, but lacking the resources to govern a centralized state. Others went further, suggesting the entire united monarchy was a literary invention created by later writers who projected their political hopes onto an imagined golden age. This interpretation gained traction precisely because it appeared to align with what archaeology was showing and what it was failing to show. One absence loomed larger than all others. A king who ruled territory as extensive as the texts described would require a palace. Not a symbolic residence or a modest dwelling, but a functional seat of power where administration occurred, where officials gathered, where the machinery of government operated. Every major kingdom in the ancient Near East left such structures behind. Egypt had its palaces, Mesopotamia had its palaces. The Philistine cities had elite architecture demonstrating centralized authority. If David ruled a kingdom of the scale described, his palace should exist somewhere beneath the soil of Israel. Yet excavation report after excavation report noted its absence. The missing palace stopped being merely a gap in the evidence. It became the evidence itself, proof that David's kingdom was smaller, weaker, and more limited than tradition claimed. This conclusion hardened into consensus over decades.
This incredible story of this man, King David, and through their work, we're going to get a better understanding of who this man really is and how his story and the story of the Bible connect to what we're finding on the ground today.
New students entering archaeology were taught that David's kingdom lacked material support. The idea of finding his palace was treated as unlikely by cautious scholars and impossible by skeptical ones. Academic conferences increasingly treated David as a marginal figure whose importance had been inflated by religious tradition. That settled feeling shaped how excavations were planned and where researchers chose to dig. The question of David's kingdom seemed answered, and the answer was disappointment. The archaeologists who refused to quit. While the academic world grew comfortable with a diminished David, two researchers could not accept that the case was closed. Professor Yosef Garfinkel of Hebrew University and Sar Ganner of the Israel Antiquities Authority approached the problem from a different angle. They were not driven by religious expectation or desire to prove ancient texts correct. According to colleagues who worked with them, their motivation was simpler and more stubborn. They wanted to know whether archaeology had truly exhausted every possibility or whether it had simply been looking in the wrong places. One question bothered them more than any other. Why had early Judah been studied almost exclusively through Jerusalem? The city had been excavated repeatedly for over a century. Layer after layer had been disturbed by construction, destruction, and rebuilding across millennia. Later civilizations had dismantled earlier structures and reused their stones. If royal architecture from David's era once existed there, it might have been erased entirely by subsequent development. Garfinkel and Ganor began to suspect that searching for a young kingdom's evidence in its most heavily developed location was a methodological error. A new kingdom might leave clearer traces at its edges than at its center. This insight redirected their attention toward border regions.
Professor Yossi Garfinkel is the lead archaeologist at Khirbet Qeiyafa, where he began excavating in the summer of 2007. He believes he's uncovered a walled Judean city that was part of the kingdom ruled from Jerusalem by the biblical King David.
Frontiers are where emerging states often express power most visibly. Border zones face external threats. They require fortification, planning, and the ability to mobilize resources under pressure. If David's kingdom possessed centralized authority, that authority would manifest along contested boundaries where control mattered most. Garfinkel and Ganor began reviewing data from fortified sites dating to the early Iron Age, looking for locations that previous researchers might have overlooked or dismissed too quickly. One site kept resurfacing in their analysis. Khirbet Qeiyafa sat on a rocky hill overlooking the Elah Valley, far from major cities and modern roads. Earlier surveys had noted stone remains on the hilltop, but nothing that attracted serious attention. The location seemed isolated and difficult to access. To most observers, it looked like just another ruined hilltop among thousands scattered across the landscape. But when Garfinkel and Ganner examined the preliminary data more carefully, patterns emerged that did not fit casual dismissal. Survey measurements suggested unusually thick walls. The visible layout hinted at deliberate planning rather than organic growth. According to early assessments, the site appeared to have been constructed quickly and intentionally, rather than developed slowly over generations. Colleagues warned them against overinterpreting preliminary signs. Linking any archaeological site to King David was considered academically dangerous.
About 20 miles outside of Jerusalem, archaeologists found the best example yet of a fortified city in Judah from the time of King David.
For decades, scholars who made bold claims about David's kingdom had faced intense scrutiny, public challenges to their interpretations, and accusations of forcing archaeology to fit religious expectations. Younger researchers were often advised to avoid the subject entirely if they wanted stable careers. The professional risks were real and well documented. Despite these warnings, Garfinkel and Ganner proceeded. They suspected Khirbet Qeiyafa was not a random village or temporary camp, but a site connected to authority and strategic control. Its position above a major valley suggested military intent. Whoever built it wanted visibility, command, and the ability to monitor movement through contested territory. Securing funding and permits required navigating bureaucratic obstacles while defending their approach against skeptical colleagues. There was no guarantee the site would produce anything beyond walls and rubble. According to accounts from those involved, genuine anxiety accompanied the decision to proceed. But once full excavation began, results emerged almost immediately that did not align with accepted models of what 10th century BCE Judah should look like. The walls that should not exist. As excavation moved beyond surface clearance, the first signs of trouble for the established consensus began appearing. Stone walls emerged from the soil, but these were not the modest barriers expected from a supposedly weak and undeveloped society. According to excavation reports, the walls were massive, thick, and carefully constructed. Their scale exceeded anything archaeologists had anticipated finding at a Judahite site from this period. The more wall sections the team exposed, the more concern spread among those watching the work unfold. The city layout compounded the problem. Streets and structures followed deliberate patterns, buildings aligned with clear intention. Space had been planned in advance rather than filled organically over generations. This was not a settlement that had grown slowly through accumulation. According to analysis of the construction patterns, it appeared to have been designed and built within a concentrated period following a unified plan. That level of coordination raised immediate questions about who possessed the authority to organize such work. Planned cities do not build themselves. They require leadership capable of directing labor, allocating resources, and enforcing a coherent vision across an entire project. Then came the gates. Excavators uncovered not one, but two monumental gates built directly into the fortifications. This discovery triggered immediate unease. Most fortified cities from this period had a single gate. One entrance was easier to defend and required fewer resources to construct and maintain. Two gates demanded more labor, more materials, and more sophisticated defensive planning. According to reports from the site, the engineering quality of these gates suggested importance extending beyond local needs. This was not a village protecting itself from occasional raids. This was infrastructure designed for strategic significance. The discovery gained additional weight when scholars noticed its connection to ancient texts. The biblical name Sha'araim means two gates.
But because in that city there are only two gates, and this is one of them, and two gates in Hebrew, Sha'araim, then maybe this is the biblical city. In that place, we found two models of the temple.
The site's location matched geographic descriptions associated with that name. Some researchers cautiously suggested the correspondence might be coincidental. Others found the match too specific to dismiss. According to discussions within academic circles, this was the moment when Khirbet Qeiyafa transformed from an unusual site into an uncomfortable one. The evidence was beginning to point somewhere that many scholars did not want to go. Geography deepened the implications. The Elah Valley was not remote territory. It functioned as a major corridor linking the coastal plains controlled by the Philistines to the central highlands where Israelite populations concentrated. Control of this passage would have been critical for any emerging kingdom. A fortified city overlooking the valley suggested strategic intent at a high level. Whoever built this place cared about monitoring movement, projecting power, and defending against threats from the West. That was not the behavior of a minor tribal settlement. That was the behavior of a state. Scientific testing locked the timeline into place. Carbon dating performed on olive pits and other organic material found sealed beneath construction layers placed the site firmly in the 10th century BCE. This was the period traditionally associated with King David. The dating left little room to push the site earlier into a pre-Davidic era or later into a period when centralized authority was already acknowledged. According to excavation data, the chronological alignment was precise enough to eliminate comfortable escape routes. Explanations began to strain under the weight of accumulating evidence. The proof of royal administration. As work continued at Khirbet Qeiyafa, attention shifted from defensive structures to what lay inside the city walls. Near the highest point of the settlement, archaeologists uncovered large buildings unlike anything else at the site. These structures occupied commanding positions visible from much of the city below. According to excavation reports, their placement was intentional. In ancient settlements, the most important buildings consistently appeared at the highest and most prominent locations. Whoever used these structures wanted them seen, wanted their authority displayed through architecture itself. Nearby sections of the excavation revealed a different kind of evidence that proved equally significant. Archaeologists began finding designated storage areas containing large ceramic vessels.
Then, they discovered part of a jar handle in a storage pit in the ground.
Not a few containers scattered among domestic debris, but hundreds of jars concentrated in organized spaces. The quantity immediately raised questions. This amount of storage far exceeded what any single household or small community would require. The jars were similar in size and shape, suggesting standardized production rather than individual craftsmanship for family use. Someone was manufacturing containers at scale for a specific administrative purpose. Closer examination made the implications unavoidable. Many jars carried seal impressions stamped into their handles before firing. These marks were not decorative flourishes. According to specialists in ancient administration, such seals indicated official control over contents. They signaled that goods had been collected, recorded, and managed under centralized authority. Seal impressions functioned as bureaucratic tools, allowing officials to track resources moving through collection and distribution systems. This technology only appears when power is organized enough to require accounting. The scale of storage transformed how the site was understood. This was not surplus accumulated for household survival during lean seasons. It suggested systematic collection from surrounding areas. Food and goods were being gathered from multiple sources, consolidated at a central location, and presumably redistributed according to administrative decisions. That process has a name. It is called taxation. Taxation does not operate spontaneously. It requires coordination, record-keeping, enforcement, and oversight. Someone had to decide what was collected, how much was owed, where it was stored, and how it would be used. That level of organization requires authority extending above the local level. The storage systems and seal impressions pointed unmistakably toward centralized control, but they did not name a specific ruler. Critics attempted to explain the findings as evidence of regional governance rather than royal administration.
I found the citadel around the spring, and I believe that that citadel is the citadel of Zion. This is the citadel that King David...
Perhaps a local strongman organized the site. Perhaps military necessity drove the planning without requiring a king. These arguments kept scholarly debate alive, but they grew increasingly strained as more evidence accumulated. The site demonstrated organized power, systematic planning, and administrative capacity. The only question remaining was whose power, whose planning, and whose administration the evidence represented. The backlash from the establishment. As findings from Khirbet Qeiyafa entered academic circulation, the response was not acceptance, but fierce resistance. According to reports from conferences and peer review processes, many scholars moved quickly to challenge every implication the site carried. The evidence was real and could not be denied, but its meaning became the battlefield. The stakes were clear to everyone involved. If the interpretations held, decades of published work and accepted models would collapse. Critics attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Some argued that Khirbet Qeiyafa was too far from Jerusalem to represent Davidic authority. According to this objection, a royal outpost could not exist at such distance from the capital. Supporters countered that early kingdoms routinely established strongholds along their borders precisely because frontiers required visible power projection. But the argument created delay and introduced doubt. Others questioned cultural identity. Some scholars proposed that the site might belong to a different ethnic group entirely. Perhaps Philistines built it, perhaps Canaanites. According to these interpretations, fortifications and planning did not necessarily indicate Judahite presence. Pottery styles, dietary remains, architectural methods, and material culture became contested evidence as each side fought to claim or disclaim the site's connection to David's kingdom. Minimizing strategies proliferated. A common suggestion reframed Khirbet Qeiyafa as a temporary military installation. According to this explanation,
King David from here, together with his soldiers and close confidants, would see everything that was happening in the city.
The strong walls and storage systems existed only to support short-term defensive operations. This allowed critics to acknowledge the physical evidence while denying its implications for state-level organization. Supporters argued that the permanence and quality of construction made this interpretation implausible, but certainty remained elusive. Dating became another battleground. Although carbon testing placed construction in the 10th century BCE, some scholars attempted to shift the timeline just far enough to break the connection to David. These arguments focused on statistical margins of error rather than new data, trying to create enough uncertainty to maintain alternative explanations. Professional pressure on the excavation team intensified. Garfinkel and Ganor faced repeated challenges to their methods and conclusions. Their findings were scrutinized with intensity that critics did not apply equally to interpretations favoring the established consensus. The resistance depended on one crucial assumption: if the most impressive structure at the site could still be explained as something other than royal architecture. The debate could continue indefinitely. According to reports from the excavation team, that assumption would not survive what they uncovered at the summit of the hill, the building that silenced the critics. The turning point arrived when archaeologists completed excavation of the largest structure at Khirbet Qeiyafa. It stood at the very summit of the site, elevated above every surrounding building, positioned to overlook both the city and the valley below. According to excavation reports, the structure did not reveal itself suddenly. As more of its outline emerged from the soil, unease spread across the team. What they were uncovering could not be described as ordinary construction or accidental development. This was something deliberately built to dominate everything around it. The scale alone forced reconsideration of everything critics had argued. The building exceeded all known Judahite structures from the 10th century BCE. This was not a modest adjustment to scholarly expectations. It broke the established scale completely. According to observers present during the excavation, this was the moment when earlier explanations began feeling inadequate. A structure of this magnitude demanded resources, labor coordination, and sustained authority that critics had insisted did not exist in David's era. Its very existence posed questions that comfortable answers could not satisfy. Layout analysis reinforced what scale suggested. The building followed clear and deliberate design principles. It was not the result of gradual expansion or opportunistic construction over generations. According to architectural assessments, the planning indicated elite use rather than domestic function. This was a place designed for governance, decision-making, and the exercise of power. The more carefully specialists studied the structure, the harder it became to classify it as anything minor or utilitarian. Position magnified significance. Sitting at the highest point of the settlement, the building commanded views of both the city below and the strategic valley beyond. Movement along roads approaching from any direction could be monitored from its vantage point. According to interpretations offered by multiple researchers, this placement made sense only if the occupants required constant visibility and oversight of surrounding territory. Temporary installations do not require such positioning. Permanent seats of authority do. Construction quality demanded explanation. Building at this scale required organized labor sustained over extended periods. It required reliable resource supply chains delivering materials to the site. It required planning sophisticated enough to execute a unified design. According to estimates discussed among specialists, such a project could not be completed without leadership capable of directing people and materials over considerable time. This was not something a local strongman could arrange through personal influence alone. The structure reflected institutional power, stability, and long-term vision. Carbon dating sealed the chronological argument. Organic material from relevant layers placed construction firmly within the 10th century BCE, the period traditionally associated with David's reign. Critics attempted to exploit statistical margins, but the date range refused to drift far enough to escape the central problem. The building existed. It existed at the right time. It existed at a scale that demanded royal explanation. Comparable evidence from other Judahite sites added cumulative weight. Similar signs of planning, administrative control, and elite architecture appeared at locations across the region. Not identical structures, but consistent patterns suggesting systematic organization rather than isolated anomaly. A single unusual site can be dismissed as exceptional. A pattern across multiple sites suggests a system. Once the system becomes visible, the list of possible explanations contracts rapidly. No known local figure matches the scale, timing, and geographic scope that the evidence demands. The structure at Khirbet Qeiyafa, combined with its administrative systems, strategic position, and regional parallels, points toward exactly the kind of centralized authority that biblical texts attribute to David. Not every scholar agrees on every interpretive detail.
Israeli archaeologists have discovered writing on a charred 1,500-year-old piece of parchment using advanced digital imaging technology.
Academic debate continues on specific points, but the confident dismissal that dominated for decades has lost its foundation. The palace exists, the administration existed, the kingdom existed, and the king who built it finally has material evidence to match the texts that remembered his name. Think about what we've witnessed. For over a century, experts dismissed an entire chapter of history because the evidence had not yet been found, turning absence of proof into proof of absence, and letting professional caution harden into professional blindness. Yet beneath a hilltop ignored by consensus, the ground told a different story. Massive walls, planned streets, monumental gates, administrative systems, and a palace so vast it silenced skeptics. Someone ruled here. Someone built. Centralized authority existed in Judah at the exact time and place where David was said to reign. This discovery is more than a revelation about one king. It is a reminder that knowledge is constructed, that consensus can become a prison, and that the past does not yield its secrets to comfort or tradition. Archaeology is patient, and the earth keeps its truths buried until someone dares to dig where others will not. The questions remain. How many chapters of history have been prematurely dismissed? How much of our understanding rests on absence rather than evidence? The story is far from over, and the ground still holds secrets that could rewrite everything we think we know about the foundations of civilization.